Hi, folks. Happy, what is today, Thursday? We're a little bit later in the week. I'm joined by Lauren Smith, one of our policy counsels. A lot of you know of Lauren's connected car work. That's the most glamorous, exciting work we do at FPF. At least I think so. She gets to really understand the way the future of mobility is going to be changing, hopefully for the better, the safety of our driving. And of course, there are algorithms and artificial intelligence that are going to be helping shape the decisions that those vehicles make. So it's a pretty good match that Lauren also does some of the leading work for us on our work around harms, automated decision making. We started maybe a year ago, trying to help make sense of a lot of the concerns that we see showing up around the harms that people are worrying about when it comes to big data. A lot of the harms are obviously about discrimination. And it seemed like some of the areas that were being raised as new concerns were employment discrimination that was perhaps already illegal. But then there were new kinds of discrimination that seemed to be maybe not illegal, but certainly unfair. And then there were things that probably aren't necessarily wrong, but might be places where you might not want to take action because it might be considered maybe too intrusive or not in your public policy view. Maybe somebody else might actually think that was a good practice. Anyway, we started trying to make sense of it. Lauren picked up the work as she took a hard look at a lot of the literature around automated decisions. All sorts of academics are writing, civil society folks raising concerns. What should you, if you're a company, do? How do you understand the issues that are being raised? So Lauren, let me turn to you, because this report you put out at the recent FTC workshop on informational injury was really very well received, I think, by both industry and advocates because of how it really took a big look at this problem. And Melanie will post a link to it in the comments if you haven't already seen it. But give us a bit of a sense of what you did here and what you learned about the possible harms around automated decision making.
Yeah, so I'll give you a bit of an overview of the project. So as Jules mentioned, we find that as the volume of consumer data grows, the number of decisions that previously may have been made by humans are now being made by algorithms. And in a lot of ways, that kind of decision making can help us sort of mitigate discrimination, help us identify and understand a little better how decisions are being made, because an algorithm may be more understandable than the thinking in a human brain. But it also can raise the specter of negative impacts on vulnerable communities, depending on how different data points are used. So we've been part of a number of conversations on this topic and find that often there's so much packed into this issue that sometimes folks wind up conflating the causes with the harms, with the solutions. And, there are some inequities we've had in society for a long time that are not related to technology, but can become something that we need to think about differently when it comes to technology, and that may be impacted by sort of the way we're processing and gathering information today. So what we wanted to do was create some clarity by really trying to isolate as a first step. So what are the harms that we're actually worried about? What are the harms that have been identified in the literature? We wanted to see if there's a way to sort of group them logically so that we could understand as a next step sort of how to tackle them, which are the ones that we're most concerned about as a society, which are the ones that we've already established norms and laws on in society that can help us sort of draw bright lines about how we think about and define these issues. So the first outcome of the project was this multicolored chart that, again, we'll link to at the bottom. And so we found that first, we identified sort of these two broad categories of concerns. So the first category, which is this column, is places where algorithmic decision-making could turbocharge or make more opaque harms to individuals. And then the second is collective and societal harms. You got double duty here now. So for the first, we split it into two sections where we found that in some cases, some of the harms may have already been identified as illegal in society. So for topics like employment discrimination, filtering job candidates by race or by genetic health information is something that we already have laws on the books saying we don't want this to happen. There are other instances that may be considered unfair that aren't explicitly illegal, such as filtering candidates by work proximity, which if you study it further could potentially involve excluding minorities in certain cases. And then we tried to dig into the sort of substantive buckets to see what are the areas that folks have identified concerns. So we found that those broadly fit into 4 categories. The first is the blue, loss of opportunity. The second is economic loss. Third is social detriment. And the fourth is loss of liberty. And then under each category, we identified the main subcategories sort of harms that folks have identified in this space.
So how would someone use this, right? I mean, to be clear, we're not suggesting that all of these are actually harmful harms or that they all ought to be illegal, but perhaps you want to, perhaps if you're looking at a product or a service and you want to assess all of the possible impacts, this might be a really good chart to go through and say, hey, is this happening? Is this happening? Is this happening? You might, in some cases, say, well, yeah, it's happening, but I know about it and I'm taking action maybe elsewhere to deal with it. So let's tie it, since maybe we're on social media, let's tie it to something that's been very much in the news. Let's assume perhaps an advertiser is using an algorithm and they're choosing, hey, I want to show ads to one segment or not one segment. So you might look through here and you might say, well, wait a second, is there a problem here of employment discrimination or loss of opportunity? But your answer then might be, well, no, I don't want to stop doing that. I just want to make sure that I'm actually reaching that class in another way. Maybe I want to ask that question, or I want the issue flagged, right? It may not be by definition wrong, but it might be something you want to flag so that you make the right determination about that. Let's jump maybe to the mitigation sets, because I think I just actually set up.
Yeah, answers your question.
Well, okay, we'll see.
So yeah, I'm glad you asked, Jules. So the second chart that we came up with after sort of establishing the first taxonomy is a chart of potential mitigation sets. So here, and there's a lot of detail, but we'll link to it. This chart uses the taxonomy to categorize harms even further into groups that are sufficiently similar to each other that they might be amenable to the same kind of mitigation strategies. So attempts to sort of approach these issues will require a range of tools and strategies. But what we found is that based on whether harms were sort of individual harms that we've identified as illegal, they would be treated differently from, say, individual harms that are unfair and don't have an illegal analog. So up at the top here, the individual harms with illegal that are illegal, those are areas where, again, we've got clear law, we've got clear social norms about what we want to avoid. And so technology may introduce complexities. So even though you may know you're not supposed to hire based on race or make hiring decisions based on race, there are concerns that could arise that data could be used as a proxy for race. So for example, you may not make a decision based on the race that a person has checked in their form, but if you can see some of their online profiles, you may know what type of shampoo that they use, and that could communicate race in certain contexts. So that bucket of harms, and that includes things like employment discrimination, insurance and social benefit discrimination, housing, education, credit discrimination, some kinds of differential pricing, some kinds of individual incarceration. Those are harms that, again, there's more clarity on. And so we identify some mitigation tools there, such as data methods to ensure that proxies aren't being used for protected classes, and making sure that data doesn't amplify historical biases. algorithmic design. So looking at the inputs to algorithmic decision making and consider, whether to use, it becomes complex, honestly. In some cases, it may be helpful to know whether certain folks are part of protected classes to ensure that you are not excluding them. Sometimes we, may want to collect more sensitive information in order to ensure that we're not furthering discrimination. But making sure that these things are being considered in the process. I think there's not really sort of black and white clear answers here. I think this is all new to everyone in the ecosystem, how to tackle these issues, but sort of making sure that you're thinking through them, evaluating what is happening in your system, and evaluating the inputs and how decisions are being made. And in some cases, maybe triggering manual reviews where there is sensitive
So one thing that's interesting, I've seen people already starting to use this for GDPR compliance, where people are doing perhaps a data protection impact assessment, or in looking at legitimate interest, in deciding things like high risk. The goal in GDPR seems to encourage a look at the rights and freedoms of the individual, and in many cases this helps capture a good number of those. Maybe another good example might be, let's take, again, since we're on social media, let's take filter bubbles. You often see discussion of whether or not algorithms that personalize what you see create a narrowing where you're seeing only what you see and your perspective is being narrowed. Now, is that a bad thing? Well, presumably we have a social view here that even if you choose to see what's interesting to you, you may be creating divisions in society, right? And so not clear we want to prevent anybody from choosing. Google does a very good job at providing search results that I want by taking into account my previous results. You don't want to ban that. You don't want to restrict that, I would hope. But perhaps the solution is product design. I should know perhaps that my results are going to be different. If I don't know that searching for Apple gives me one result and gives a farmer a different result, or areas where policy issues are narrowed. But maybe you want to encourage product developers to do more to indicate this is what you get, see what others are getting, or see what a non-filter version is. Similarly, perhaps Facebook has done a lot to try to make sure that people have awareness of the factors that go into their news feed. One could encourage sort of more to help people understand that they're seeing a filter. Now, will they change their behavior? I don't know. I've got relatives that they want to watch Fox News and they know what they're getting. And I can't say, that a warning saying, hey, other channels will have different views, will make them change the channel. So I think we want to flag some of these things, but make it very clear that these aren't necessarily areas where there's societal consensus, but there are certainly issues to be aware of. A paper that I might recommend, I don't know if you read this one yet, it's one of the papers that our Privacy Papers for Policymakers event. We'll post a link to that, where we, our advisory board and a number of judges have selected the academic papers that we think are most valuable for policymakers to see and understand. And the authors write up a one-page summary. So those of you who are too busy to write, to read, long academic papers and want the key points distilled, the academics have given us a one-page summary. So Solon Barakas and Karen Levy have a paper that goes through the way different platforms make decisions. And when I say platforms, they're looking at Airbnb, they're looking at social media, they're looking at a range, and by what they ask, or how they label what they ask, or when they ask, and do they put a picture, they set the tone in some ways that can, push away from possible, even self-selected discrimination. So we hope you'll take a chance to take a look. If you want a hard copy, we'll even send you one of those, because we're really proud of how this came out. And if you want to discuss with us ways that this might be used to sort of flesh out fairness or data protection impact assessments on the GDPR. Anyway, great job, Lauren, really well received, and we hope something that will be useful for those of you who are thinking hard about how to deal with some of these issues. Privacy papers for policymakers. Melanie, what's the date?
February 27th.
February 27th. Please join us. Commissioner Terrell McSweeney will be giving an FTC reaction to the papers. Many of the academics who I mentioned will be in town for armchair discussions about their papers. It's the day before the FTC Privacy Con. Anyway, thanks for joining me today, Lauren.
Thanks for having me.
Bye, all.